There is a moment in the awakening process that almost no one talks about, and maybe that's because this moment isn't beautiful, it isn't filled with light, it doesn't feel spiritual. In fact, it can feel like the opposite of all of that. It can feel empty, confusing, even slightly uncomfortable. It is the moment when something within you begins to realize that what you have always believed yourself to be may have never truly been you, and this realization doesn't arrive as an answer. It doesn't come as immediate relief. It doesn't show up as a clear thought saying, "Now I understand." No, it appears in a much more subtle way, almost imperceptibly. Like a small internal shift, as if something within you took a step back, and for the first time, simply began to observe. Observing your thoughts, observing your emotions, observing your reactions, and maybe you didn't even notice it clearly at first. Maybe it was just a moment, a brief instant, almost lost in the middle of your day, but something was different, because in that moment, you were not completely inside your mind, you were seeing, and that difference, although it seems small, is absolutely transformative. But here is something that may surprise you. This space you began to notice is not new. It has always been there, always, from the very beginning, but for most of your life you never looked at it, because your attention was always directed somewhere else. Toward thoughts, toward stories, toward worries, toward what happened, toward what might happen, toward everything the mind constantly produces. And when you are completely immersed in that, there is no space, there is no distance. There is only identification. You don't observe the thought, you are the thought. You don't notice the emotion, you are the emotion. You don't see the story, you are living inside it, without questioning, without noticing, without even imagining that something exists beyond it. But then, something begins to change, and this change doesn't need to be dramatic. It doesn't require a spiritual event. It can begin in the simplest way. Maybe in a moment of silence, maybe in a moment of mental exhaustion, maybe after repeating the same patterns so many times, that something within you simply stops. And in that stopping, in that small gap, something reveals itself. You notice, you see, you realize that you are thinking, and that moment is far more profound than it seems. Because the instant you become aware of a thought, you are no longer completely inside it. There is distance, there is space, there is separation, and that separation changes everything, because it reveals something essential. There is something in you that is not the thought, something that exists before it, something that remains, while thoughts come and go. But this is where a deeper part of the journey begins, because at first, this doesn't feel like freedom. It can feel strange. It can feel like you are moving away from yourself, like something is disconnecting. And that can create a subtle sense of uncertainty, because the mind has always been your reference point. It has been how you interpreted the world, how you made decisions, how you built your identity. And now something is observing all of that, without engaging, without reacting, without trying to control. And this raises deep questions. If I can observe my mind, then who is observing? If thoughts appear on their own, without my choice, then who am I? And these are not just ideas, they are direct experiences. Because if you truly look, if you truly pay attention, you will notice something very clear. Thoughts simply arise. They do not ask permission, they do not announce themselves, they appear and disappear. And if you observe even more closely, you will notice something even more curious. You do not choose your next thought, it simply comes. So if you don't choose your thoughts, if you can observe them, if they arise and disappear without control, what does that say about who you are? This question cannot be answered by the mind, because any answer will still be a thought. And what we are exploring here exists beyond thought. It is something that must be seen, felt, recognized directly. And this recognition begins in a very simple way, by observing, without trying to change anything, without trying to improve, without trying to reach a destination, just noticing. But here comes an important challenge, because the habit of identifying with thoughts is extremely strong. It is automatic, and even after noticing this space, you may get lost again within seconds, back into the stream, back into identification, and that is completely natural, because this pattern has been built over years, maybe your entire life. So this is not about fighting the mind, it is not about forcing silence, it is about recognizing that you are not what appears. And the more this recognition begins to repeat, the more this inner space expands, the more presence becomes clear, and something begins to change in the way you live. You begin to notice moments where there is no effort, no control, no need to interfere, only presence. And in those moments, there is a different feeling, lighter, more open, more silent, but at the same time, much more alive, much more real. And this opens a new possibility. What if life is not about controlling everything? What if it is not about thinking more, solving more, fighting more? What if there is another way of being that does not depend on the mind? This possibility may feel distant now, but it has already begun. The moment you noticed that you are observing, and this is exactly where something much deeper begins to unfold. After you begin to notice this space, something very subtle starts to happen within you, and at first it may seem almost insignificant, almost as if nothing has really changed, because externally, everything remains the same. Your routine continues. People are still there, situations still arise, challenges still exist, but internally, something is no longer the same. There is a small shift in how you experience everything, and this shift is not in what happens, but in how you relate to what happens. Before, every thought seemed to carry weight. Every emotion felt final. Every situation demanded an immediate reaction. It was as if you were constantly inside an automatic flow, reacting, interpreting, defending, trying to control, trying to predict, trying to fix, always trying, and that creates a constant tension, a subtle but continuous sense of effort, as if you were always trying to hold something together, even without realizing it. But now, with this small space that has begun to appear, something starts to slow down. And you may notice this in very simple ways at first. A moment where you don't react immediately, an instant where a thought appears, and you simply observe, without fully believing it, without automatically following it. And that may seem small, but in reality, it is the beginning of a profound transformation, because for the first time there is a choice, even if subtle, even if almost invisible. You are no longer completely trapped in the automatic. There is a pause, and within that pause there is freedom. But this freedom does not come as something explosive. It doesn't come as excitement. It comes as something much quieter, almost subtle, like a light sense of relief, as if something has softened within you. And the more you begin to notice this, the more this space becomes accessible. But here is something important. This space cannot be forced. It cannot be created by the mind. Because the moment you try to create presence, you are already back in control. And this is something many people don't realize. They try to turn presence into a technique, into an effort, into something to achieve. But that is just the mind trying to stay in control, trying to turn even silence into another activity. And that's why many people feel frustrated in this process, because they are trying to make presence happen, when in reality, presence is already here. It does not need to be created. It only needs to be recognized. And that changes everything. Because now it's not about doing more. It's about noticing more, observing more, interfering less. And when this begins to happen, something very interesting emerges. You begin to realize that not everything needs a response. Not everything needs an immediate solution. Not everything needs to be controlled. And that can feel uncomfortable at first, because the mind has been trained to react, to fix, to act. And when you don't follow that impulse, a strange feeling may arise, as if you are missing something, as if you are losing control. But in reality, you are stepping out of an old pattern, a pattern based on constant effort. And the more you allow this space, the more you begin to notice something even deeper. Life continues to happen, but you are no longer completely trapped in it. You participate, but you don't get lost. You feel, but you don't drown. You think, but you don't become the thought. And this creates a new way of living, lighter, more fluid, less reactive. But there is still something important to see, because even with this space, the mind still tries to come back. It still tries to take control. It still tries to turn everything back into thought. And it does this in very subtle ways. Sometimes as analysis, sometimes as doubt, sometimes as overthinking, and without noticing, you can slip back into the automatic. But now there is a fundamental difference. You can see it. You can notice when it happens. And that awareness is already part of the transformation. Because now, you are no longer completely unconscious within the process. You begin to see the movement, and that opens a new possibility. What if you don't need to follow every thought? What if you don't need to believe everything that appears? What if you could simply observe and let it pass? This possibility becomes real, not as an idea, but as an experience. And this deeply changes how you live. But something even deeper is beginning to emerge behind all of this. Something not just related to thoughts, but to the very way you perceive reality. And that is exactly what begins to reveal itself from here. As this inner space becomes more present within you, something even deeper begins to reveal itself. And this doesn't happen instantly. It's not something you decide to see. It's something that begins to unfold when you stop interfering, because as long as there is effort, as long as there is trying, as long as there is control, there is a layer between you and reality. A layer made of thoughts, interpretations, judgments, expectations. And that layer filters everything. It turns the direct experience of life into a mental version of life, and for a long time, you live inside that version, without realizing it, believing that it is reality. But when this space of observation deepens, something very interesting happens. That layer becomes visible. You begin to see the filters. You begin to notice how the mind interprets everything, how it creates meaning, how it reacts automatically. And when you see this, something breaks. Not violently, but silently. The belief that this is the only way to experience life begins to weaken, and this opens space for something completely new, a way of perceiving, without filters, without immediate interpretation, without the need to turn everything into thought. And maybe you've already felt this, in very simple moments, the sound of the wind, the movement of water, the silence between thoughts, the sensation of your own body, without labeling, without analyzing. And in those moments, there is something very different. There is pure presence, and that presence does not need explanation. It does not need to be understood. It does not need interpretation. It simply is. But here is something most people don't realize. The mind does not like this. Because the mind exists through interpretation, it feeds on meaning, on control, on predictability. And when you begin to access moments of pure presence, without narrative, without control, without effort, the mind tries to come back. It tries to regain control, and this can happen in very subtle ways, through thoughts like, I need to maintain this state, I'm doing it, I can't lose this, and without noticing, you are back in the mind, turning presence into another goal. But presence cannot be maintained, because it is not a state, it is what remains, when you stop interfering. And this changes everything, because now it's not about achieving something, it's about stopping what is unnecessary, stopping the interference, stopping the effort, and allowing experience to unfold, without control. And when this becomes more natural, something even deeper begins to emerge. You begin to notice that there is an intelligence beyond the mind, an intelligence that does not think, but knows, an intelligence that does not analyze, but perceives, an intelligence that does not control, but guides. And this may be very subtle at first. It may appear as a feeling, a light intuition, a sense of direction, without explanation. But the more you remain in this space, the clearer this intelligence becomes, and you begin to realize something surprising. You don't need to think as much as you used to. You don't need to control as much as before, because there is something within you that already knows. Not intellectually, but directly, immediately. And this changes how you act, how you decide, how you move through life, because now action is no longer coming only from the mind. It begins to arise from a deeper place, a quieter place, a more aligned place. But here is something very important. The mind may try to take ownership of this. It may try to turn this intelligence into another concept, another idea, another form of control. And this is very subtle, because it can feel like you are following intuition, but there is still interference, still effort. And that's why this process requires something essential: inner honesty, recognizing when you are truly present, and when you are trying to control the experience. And as this clarity deepens, trust begins to emerge. Not blind trust, not belief, but trust based on direct experience. You begin to notice that when you don't interfere, things unfold differently. Answers appear, actions arise, paths open, and this doesn't mean life becomes perfect. Challenges still exist, difficult situations still arise, emotions still come, but your relationship to them changes completely. There is more space, more clarity, less resistance. And within that space, something very deep begins to stabilize, a sense of presence, not as a special state, but as a foundation, something that is always there, even when thoughts appear, even when emotions arise, even as life moves. And it is from this point that something even deeper begins to emerge, something not only related to your inner experience, but to the very nature of reality itself. And this opens a new level of perception, far beyond what the mind can comprehend. And it is exactly at this point that something even deeper begins to reveal itself, because until now you have started to notice that you are not your thoughts. You have begun observing the mind. You have felt this subtle space of presence opening within you. But there is something beyond all of that, something that doesn't just change how you feel, but transforms the very way reality is experienced. Because as this presence begins to stabilize, even if only for brief moments, a new way of perceiving begins to emerge. And this shift is not something dramatic. It doesn't arrive as a sudden explosion of clarity. It unfolds quietly, gently, almost unnoticed at first, but once it begins, it cannot be unseen. Before this, reality seemed solid, defined, separate. There was you, and there was everything else. There was an inside, and there was an outside. There was the observer, and there was the world being observed, and everything felt divided, structured, organized through the mind, through concepts, through interpretation. But as presence deepens, that structure begins to loosen, and something very subtle starts to happen. The boundary between you and what you perceive begins to blur, not intellectually, not as an idea, but as a direct experience. And maybe you have already felt this. In very simple moments where you were fully here, not thinking, not analyzing, not trying to understand, just experiencing. And in those moments something changes. The usual sense of separation begins to fade. It's as if the distance between you and life dissolves, as if everything is happening in one continuous field. And this can feel unfamiliar, because the mind is used to separation. It is used to defining, to labeling, to organizing experience into categories. But presence does something different. It reveals what is here, before the mind divides it. And in that, something very profound becomes visible. You begin to notice that everything you experience is appearing within awareness, not outside of it, not separate from it, but within it. The sound, the sensation, the thought, the emotion, the world, all of it, appearing in the same space. And this space is not something distant. It is not something abstract. It is what you are. But this is where something important must be understood. This cannot be grasped through thinking, because the mind will try to turn this into a concept, into something to understand, to define, to explain. But this is not something to understand. It is something to recognize, and recognition happens in silence. It happens when the mind relaxes, when the need to interpret softens, when the constant movement of trying begins to dissolve, and in that silence, something becomes undeniable. There is a presence here, unmoving, unchanging, unaffected, while everything else moves. Thoughts come and go, sensations arise and pass, emotions appear and dissolve, experiences shift, life flows, but something remains, something that does not come and does not go. And when this begins to be felt, not as an idea, but as a direct experience, something within you relaxes at a much deeper level, because now there is nothing to hold together, nothing to control, nothing to maintain. Life is no longer something you are trying to manage. It becomes something that is simply unfolding, and you are not separate from that unfolding. You are the space in which it happens. And from here, action begins to change, not because you force it, not because you decide to act differently, but because the source of action shifts. It no longer comes from tension, from fear, from the need to control outcomes. It begins to arise from clarity, from stillness, from something deeper than thought. And this is where life starts to feel different. Not necessarily easier, but lighter, more fluid, more natural. Because you are no longer resisting what is. You are no longer trying to reshape reality to fit your expectations. You are moving with it, as it. And this does not mean passivity. It does not mean you stop engaging with life. It means your engagement becomes aligned, less reactive, more conscious, more real. But here is something even more important. This is not the end of the journey. This is not a final state. This is not something you arrive at and hold forever. This is the beginning of a completely different way of being. A way that continues to deepen, to expand, to unfold, without effort, without control. And the more you allow it, the more it reveals itself, layer by layer, moment by moment, presence by presence. And maybe you are already feeling this. Maybe something within you already recognizes that what you truly are has never been limited to thought, has never been confined to the mind, has never been separate from life. And if that recognition is beginning, even in the smallest way, then something has already shifted, and it will continue to unfold, not because you force it, but because it is natural, because it is what you are. And maybe the next step is not something you need to find, but something that is already quietly emerging within you right now. And maybe the next step is already happening within you right now. Gratitude for being here. Much light on your path. Quantum silence.